Okay, so we've thoroughly covered bulb propagation, but how do we propagate all those other types of geophytes I listed? Well, first let's talk about corms. Corms are just the swollen base of a stem axis enclosed by a dry, scale-like tunic. So corms are odd because, like a tunicate bulb, they have that dry, papery tunic, but like a scaly bulb, they have contractile roots that pull them deeper down into the ground. Unlike both of them, they are just stem tissue. So just to review for you the difference between a bulb and a corm, a bulb is going to contain leaf, stem, and flower tissue. A corm only has stem tissue. So if you were to cut a corm in half, instead of seeing those layers of scales as you did in the tunicate bulb, or instead of seeing loosely arranged scales like in a scaly bulb, when you cut a corm in half, it's just a solid surface inside. There's no layers, there's no scales, it's just solid. Bulbs do not have nodes and internodes that are distinct. The basal plate is the only stem tissue in a bulb, and it's so compressed you can't see nodes and internodes. A corm, since the whole thing is stem tissue, you can see distinct nodes and internodes on it because it is a modified stem, so it has the same parts as a regular stem would have. And again, the bulb has scales, the corm is solid, it does not have scales, it does not have leaf tissue. So here's a diagram of a corm. And corms have a life cycle similar to bulbs in which there is a vegetative and a reproductive phase. Now in the reproductive phase, the corm is going to send out a flower shoot just like a bulb would, and it's going to bloom. And then following that, what's interesting with corms is the original old corm always dies, it decays, and a new corm forms directly on top of that. Now you might understand why it needs those contractile roots, because if the new corm is forming on top of the old corm every year, eventually it would come up above the surface of the ground, except for it has those contractile roots to pull it back down again. Now corms do sometimes form offsets just like bulbs do. You can see one in the picture here. They also form mini corms, just as bulb species sometimes form those mini bulbs, which we call bulblets. Corms often form additional mini corms, which we call cormels. Now the last thing I want to show you guys on this picture are the nodes and the internodes. The nodes appear as lines circling the corm. So you can find those on all corms, and then the space in between the lines are internodes. And often you will also find lateral buds on the corm, which is important for propagation purposes. So again, this just goes through the life cycle of the corm. During the vegetative stage, it's going to form new roots and leaves. In the reproductive stage, it's going to initiate that flower bud, it's going to flower, and then after flowering, the old corm shrivels up and the new corm forms on top of it. And any mini corms or cormels form. Basically, the cormels are going to form in between the old and the new corm. So you can see a photo of that here. Also, you'll notice this photo points to the fibrous roots. The corm has those fibrous roots, but also you can see the thicker roots in this picture. Those are those contractile roots. Here are some more corms. The two plants that I want you guys to think of when you think of corms are crocuses and gladiolas. These are gladiolas in this picture here. Those are both cormous species. There's not a lot of species that produce corms out there. So how do we propagate them? They can be propagated sexually by seeds. I'm not going to talk about this that much more, but all geophytes, again, can be propagated by seed. It's just that only plant breeders really do that because it takes such a long time for it to reach marketable size from seed, and you aren't going to have genetically identical offspring. Now, corms do propagate themselves in forming that new corm on top of the old corm every year, and also by the production of cormels. Each of those cormels can be broken off, planted out, and they will grow a whole new plant, although they will take a little longer than a regular size corm to bloom, just as the bulblets took longer than a regular size bulb to bloom. Corms can also be divided, so you can't twin scale or scale a corm because there's no scales in it. But in a large corm, like these gladiolus corms pictured here, You can cut it up into sections as long as each section contains a bud, and here's one right here. As long as each section contains a bud, then each section will form a cormel and then a new plant. Now another point I want to make here that I didn't make with bulbs, but it's true for them as well. Corms can be tissue cultured, so can bulbs, and so can all our other kinds of geophytes. So seed and tissue culture are two ways that all geophytes can be propagated. As for the other methods of propagation, it's pretty specific to what type of geophyte you have. The next type of geophyte I want to talk about are tubers. And tubers you may be a little more familiar with. It's a special kind of swollen modified stem with nodes and internodes which function as a storage structure as well as an organ of vegetative propagation. It's really a definition that could fit a corm as well, but tubers are usually much larger and more swollen than a corm. They also lack that papery tunic that the corm has, and they don't have contractile roots either. A better name for a tuber would be a tuberous stem, because people often confuse tubers with roots. Now these are just potatoes here in the picture, and potatoes are tubers. A lot of people think of potatoes as being roots, and they're not. They're a type of modified stem because they're a tuber. So here are some more examples of tubers. Jerusalem artichoke is an ornamental plant. You can see the nice yellow flowers there, but they do form tubers, and they actually can be cooked and eaten. They are supposed to taste somewhat like potatoes. Of course, your white or Irish potato, and in fact all potatoes, are tubers. And then caladium, which is one of a few genera that are called elephant ears commonly. Caladiums are tubers as well. So how to propagate a tuber? Well, of course, by seed and by tissue culture would both work, but another way is to essentially use a modified form of division. The same way you would do with a corm. You cut it into a section, and each section must contain nodes. Now on a tuber, those nodes usually have clusters of buds, and you call those eyes. So your eyes of a potato are actually clusters of buds at a node. And if you cut a potato into pieces that at least have one or two eyes on them, you can grow a new plant from each of those potato pieces. Now what's confusing is if you buy it from the store, they're going to sell it to you as a seed potato, and that's what you see in the picture here. It's just a piece of the potato tuber with some eyes that grows a new plant. Even though they call it a seed potato, this is not seed propagation. Seed propagation would be with actual seeds, and it's sexual propagation, which means you get genetically different offspring. Seed potatoes are actually just tuber divisions, and it's asexual propagation, so all of your seed potatoes will yield genetically identical potato plants. Here's one last rare way that you can propagate tubers. These are aerial tubers. So just as you have aerial bulblets, there are aerial tubers, and these are called tubercles. 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 They're not very common. There's only one or two species that produce them. The plant pictured here is a plant called cinnamon vine. You just pluck the tubercles off and plant them, and they will each become a new plant. Just like a cormel or a bulblet, it's going to take a little longer to produce a full-sized new plant, in this case one that produces large enough tubers that you might want to actually eat them, but they are a form of propagation, so tubercles.